Absolutely. Thank you, everybody, for coming on into here. My name is Bob Nee. I'm the National Field Coordinator with a group called CFACT. We do free market solutions for environmental issues. We basically are sort of like the anti-AOC in a lot of ways. That's sort of our selling point. And right now, CFACT does a lot of things, right? We have a lot of fantastic people that are working here. Craig, our CEO, he's been in the fight since 1985. Adam, my boss, the National Field Director, has been with us for, I believe, 6 or 7 years now. He's currently on honeymoon in Jamaica, so wish him happy marriage. And Christina's been there for a while. She does our fundraising stuff. But really, what we do, we focus on a lot of policy issues, and then we basically try to figure out how to take the policy issues and execute them on college campuses and inform college students that, this lie that the left really tells about how the government is the real solution to all problems, it's just not really, it's just that, it's a lie, right? We don't necessarily have, that's not necessarily how things work. And we, as much as we have all of these great people working with our organization, the true backbone of our organization, CFACT, is the college kids on the ground. We wouldn't be able to do it without them, in all honesty. And that's where my good friend Julia comes in. And that's where a few of the other, that's where all of the other chapters, excuse me, I'm in a hotel room. So that's where they all come in, and I'll let Julia take it away from here. Julia's done a great job with us at Liberty. So take it away, Julia.
All right, thank you, Bob. My name's Julia, as was just mentioned. I'm a freshman at Liberty University, and I'm studying government. Today we have Mr. Wrightstone with us, and he has 40 years of experience in the field of geology, and he has studied various aspects of the Earth's processes. He earned his bachelor's degree from Waynesburg University and his master's from West Virginia University, both in the field of geology. He's accepted as an expert reviewer for an intergovernmental panel on climate change, and he's also the author of the best-selling book, Inconvenient Facts, the Science That Al Gore Doesn't Want You to Know. His statement on energy, climate, and humanity is, we should use all of the Earth's resources for the betterment of mankind and do it as good stewards. He now serves as the executive director of the CO2 Coalition. His title of his speech today would be Global Warming, the Cold Hard Facts. And we also have Meredith with us today, who is the chapter president of YAF. Mr. Wrightstone, if you're ready, you can go ahead and get started.
Great, thank you so much for having me here. I always like working with young people, and I've always enjoyed having interns because I love to mentor people. What we're going to do is go through in this presentation tonight is pretty much the basics about climate change, and just a prelude to this. I'm a huge optimist of where we're headed with the debate in this country. Everywhere I go over the last several years, just random people, I would start telling them about this, and just almost to a person, they're just thirsty for this information. And how do I get people interested? Maybe it's because I wear an I love CO2 face mask. That always is a good conversation starter. But with no further ado, let's get going here, and let me share my screen. I gave this talk last month to about 60 or 70 people at the Golden Gate Breakfast Club. They were mostly liberal influencers in the San Francisco area. And after the talk, there were people that said, I've had my eyes opened. I've never heard any of this. So I think there's a possibility, if we get the facts out there, to get this. And I will say, as you go through here, we also have a companion smartphone app. Search for Inconvenient Facts. It has all 60 inconvenient facts there. So download Inconvenient Facts at the App Store or Google Play Store. I'll just say that the book has recently been translated into both Norwegian and Korean. Korean book was just published yesterday. So let's get started here. In the current climate debate, we hear about this 97% consensus. There is a pretty good consensus on a few things. Number one, CO2 has been increasing. Most of that CO2 that's increased, that we see that's increased, is from man's sources. Most of it burning of fossil fuels, some a little bit limestone manufacture. We're in a temperature rise right now. It's risen about a degree or so since the beginning of the 20th century, nothing alarming. But there is serious disagreement on two topics. Is the temperature rise we've seen over the last 60 or 80 years primarily due to man-made increases in CO2? Or is the increase in temperature primarily naturally driven by the same forces, natural forces that have been driving it since the dawn of time? And the second part of this, and we're going through this a little bit, are the changes that we see from climate change harmful or beneficial? Those are the two big questions here. Our first inconvenient fact is that carbon dioxide is not the primary greenhouse gas. You wouldn't know that if you go to the EPA site, the National Geographic site. National Geographic here lists these greenhouse gases. That's all they list. The EPA site looks like this. They list carbon dioxide is the primary greenhouse gas, methane and the others. Is that the case? Not at all. The largest greenhouse gas is water vapor, accounting for some 90% of the greenhouse effect. And if we put this in the context, if we look at greenhouse warming gases as listed by the EPA or National Geographic on the left, what it does is overemphasize the role of carbon dioxide in the greenhouse warming effect. When we place that carbon dioxide and include water vapor, the real primary mover of greenhouse gases, that CO2 impact decreases substantially. And as for the CO2, it accounts for some 0.04% of the atmosphere. It's called a trace gas. And it's actually a trace gas of the trace gases. But that 0.04% or 400 parts per million is quite important. While it might be demonized as the demon molecule, as it was today in Washington, D.C., I call it the miracle molecule because life could not survive without it. If we look back to 1958, when we started measuring CO2 at Mauna Loa Observatory, you can see the rise from, it started at about 280 parts per million before the Industrial Revolution. We're about to have another climate conference coming up this fall. You can see how much impact the other climate conferences have had. Each one of them claimed that they were going to decrease carbon dioxide emissions, and yet they never put a dent in them. And I'm okay with that because I love CO2, and you should too. I hope you will by the end of this talk. It's important to take a look over the long term. And again, I'm a geologist, so I put things in the long-term geologic perspective. This goes back to 1758 or 1751, excuse me. These are carbon dioxide emissions into the atmosphere. And you'll see this is important. I want you to look here. We really started accelerating carbon dioxide emissions in the mid-20th century. It was really that post-World War II economic boom that we really, so if we're going to see, and that's what I want you to be looking for tonight, if we're going to see impacts of carbon dioxide driven warming, it'll be in that period from the mid-20th century on. And from now on, when we look at these charts, if you see blue on the chart, it's carbon dioxide. And if it's red, it'll be temperature. And we always go from, on the left will be the oldest to the newest, most modern on the right. So what are the sources of human carbon dioxide emissions? It's fossil fuels, coal, natural gas, and oil. Interestingly, cement manufacture accounts for 5 to 6% of man-made CO2. Taking a look here at the 400,000 year history of CO2, well, it looks like a pretty unusual amount of CO2. In the top right, you'll see the red dot up there, and that's where we are today. And we're in what's called an interglacial period, warming period between the advances of the ice sheets. During each of the previous interglacial periods that are in that flesh tone or whatever it is there, the bluer the ice advances, we saw that carbon dioxide only got up to 280 or 300 parts per million. And we're at 400 today. So we know that this increase in CO2 we have today is probably man-made. And I'm okay with that again. But again, we need to put this in the long-term geologic context, as we will tonight in many things. Looking back through 600 million years of Earth's history, through into the Precambrian era, we can see that the average, remember, we're at about a little under 420 parts per million today. The average of that last 600 million years was 2,600 parts per million, 6.5 times what they are today. And more importantly, you'll see that if we look at the last 140 million years of CO2 atmospheric data, we'll see that there's been almost a linear decline of carbon dioxide. And in fact, it's a dangerous decline of carbon dioxide. And why is it dangerous? Because at the end of the last ice age, we approached and nearly crossed what I call the line of death. That's 150 parts per million. That's the minimum threshold for plant life to exist. If we had ever crossed that, that would be a true climate apocalypse from which we could not recover. And so we nearly crossed that. So what we're doing right now is adding the CO2 into the atmosphere that has been locked up during each of these great events. For example, what's called the Carboniferous period here was the great coal swamps. And it just sucked huge amounts of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, converted it from trees and into coal and sequestered that. And we're now liberating that vital nutrient, carbon dioxide. This is a chart that's used by many of the people that are promoting man-made catastrophic warming. The red again is temperature. This is surface temperatures over the last, back to 1850. Looking at this chart, and again, blue is carbon dioxide. Looking at this chart, you can make a pretty good case, can't you, that there's some correlation between CO2 and temperature. But I'll remind you, the correlation is not causation. A big important factor there. And what we need to do is we'll look here in a bit at the bigger long term. But if we take a look at that, remember we said in the post-World War II period, that's where we should have seen CO2 driven warming. But what have we seen since that period? We've seen that 60% of the time, the temperatures were either cooling or stable. And very smaller percent of that time, the temperatures were warming. Shouldn't it be just opposite of CO2's driving warming? And more interestingly, again, looking at that period from the mid 1940s to date, to the late 1970s, just as carbon dioxide started ramping up significantly, the Earth started cooling. Now I'm a little bit older than you guys, but I went to school in the mid and late 70s. And at that time, there was a lot of discussions and in my geology classes about us going into the next ice age, because we've been cooling for 30 years, all the while CO2 was rising. And then it reversed itself in the late 70s and we went into a warming trend. And again, I remember I told you that this was a good chart that people used to document some correlation between temperature and CO2. But again, we need to put it in the longer perspective. This is a chart of the Central England temperature record, the longest thermometer direct measurement that we have on Earth. And we see here that the warming trend we're in right now started more than 300 years ago. It started in the late 17th century. And we've been warming in fits and starts ever since. But you see that again, that carbon dioxide ramp up in the mid 20th century. It doesn't look, the warming before that looks very similar to the warming after we started increasing carbon dioxide. We also you'll hear people tell you, well, but the rate of increase in the 20th century, we've never had anything like that. Well, if you look at the depths of what was called the Little Ice Age for the next 40 years, the rate of warming was 10 times what we see in the 20th century. We also hear about sea level rise. There's a strong correlation. Well, there's a direct correlation between sea level rise and the melting of land-based glaciers. We can see here now that sea level rise started in the mid 1800s, and it's been rising at about the same rate with no acceleration since. And that's okay. People warn you that sea level rise is occurring. Well, yeah, but we've only seen 8 inches of sea level rise since the beginning of the 20th century. I don't think that's alarming. And you might say, well, Greg, you told us that warming started in the late 1600s. Yes. Why did it just start rising then? And that's because, again, we take a look at glaciers, strong correlation there between glacial melt and sea level rise. It took until that time in the mid 1800s for summer ice melt to exceed winter ice accumulation. And that's when the glaciers started retreating and the sea level started rising. Again, no acceleration during this post-World War II CO2 increase. If we look back through to the beginning or the end of the last ice age, we see there were 9 other warming trends, very similar to our own, but each of those other warming trends were warmer than we are today. And again, we talked about the rate of increase. I've captured the rate of increase of those 9 other warming periods. 5 of the 9 had higher rates of increase of temperature than our current warming trend in 20th century. And again, right now, we're in one of the coldest parts in Earth's history. This is a 3.5 million year history of temperature. And we're in 100,000 year glacial cycles now. We're almost 10,000 years into our current one. We will see another ice advance at some point coming up here. Probably not tomorrow or next year, and probably not for another 1,000 years, but it's coming. And again, we look at the much longer history. It's only recently that we've actually had ice at the North Pole. In much of Earth's history during this time, we had no ice at either poles. So again, we're looking at this. We are one of the coldest periods in recent Earth history. Remember I said about these other warm periods that were warmer than today? I'm showing you this here. How do we know they were warmer? We can confirm that with historical records. Like for the medieval warm period, we know that the Vikings were growing barley on Greenland. You can't do that today. The Romans were growing citrus in the north of England near Hadrian's Wall. But the thing that's fascinating here is the strong relationship between the rise and fall of temperature and the rise and fall of civilizations. These previous warm periods were associated with great prosperity, bountiful harvest, great empires, and civilizations prospered during the warm periods. And the cold periods, each cold period, when it started to cool down again, led to famine, pestilence, and mass depopulation. For example, the Minoan warm period was the Bronze Age. The great early civilizations, the Hittites, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and others prospered at this time, and they all collapsed within a short period of time when it started cooling down. So we're being told, oh my God, we can't allow it to get a degree or 2 degrees warmer, we're all gonna die. No, Earth's history and human history tells us just the opposite. According to Earth and human history, we should welcome the warmth and fear the cold. And just an interesting story here on the late Middle Ages witch hunts in Europe. Again, we had the high Middle Ages, the medieval warm period, time of great prosperity for many centuries. And then it started cooling in the 13th century. Crop failure set in, famine. People started to die and they blamed it on weather causing witches. And some 50,000 witches were killed, supposed witches were killed, most of them burned at the stake at that time. For the most part, they were widowed women living on the edge of medieval society. But what was interesting, in the 14th century, the Pope actually issued a papal bull that said, yes, there are weather causing witches, and if you find them, you need to kill them. And boy, they did. But interestingly, around 1500, it warmed up again. And crops came back. Food again was bountiful. And if I was sitting in front of you, I'd be asking you, why Why did it warm up? Why did the crops come back? And the answer, of course, is they killed all the witches. And that's what they thought. But the point of this, and in fact, if we look here, I've got a chart for my next book I've just created. I've got the number of witches killed per decade at the top and the number of extremely cold months at the bottom. So we see there was a strong correlation between cold temperatures, which led to famine, and the number of witches killed. So it's an interesting story, but the moral behind that is, again, fear the cold, fear the cold, welcome the warmth. And we'll take a look at some of the what I call climate apocalypse events coming up here now. But I live in the real world. By that, I mean, I look at what's happening today. The climate catastrophists, for the most part, predict what they think may occur 50 or 80 years in the future based on failed climate models. But with me, again, I look at historical scientific data and look at this. Well, that's what we're going to do. We're going to look at what's actually happening today. And again, these people that are predicting catastrophe for the future mainly predict it on models that overpredict warming. According to John Christie, these models overpredict warming 2.5 to 3 times too much. One of the biggest catastrophes or climate apocalypse events that's been in the news a lot lately is this notion of the 6th mass extinction event that's actually going on right now. That's what the media tells you, that extinctions are exceedingly large and growing. The UN report warned recently, well, it was in late 2019, warned of 1 million species at risk of extinction over the next several decades. Well, to get 1 million extinctions in that time frame, you'd have to have 25,000 to 30,000 extinctions per year. This was the chart they included in the book, in their report. This was the UN report. If you look, it looks pretty scary. It's pretty alarming. Take a closer look. It starts in the year 1500, and they have 1 data point per century. And my alarm bells started going off when I got this. And I dug into it. I went back and actually looked at the same data. It's called the IUCN Red List. And instead of looking at it on a century by century basis, I took a look at it by decadal every 10 years. And this is the entire list back to 1500. Looks a little bit different. And if we just look at the area from the number of extinctions from the late 1800s to now, you can see they've actually been in significant decline. And in fact, remember I said you would need 25,000 to 30,000 extinctions per year to get to 1 million. Well, you know what it's been for the last 40 years? Two extinctions per year. Like, well, we'll get to 25,000 soon. No, we won't. No, we won't. The summary of this report should have concluded we're doing a really, really, really good job preserving our endangered species. They started with their conclusion and fit and tortured the data to make it work, to make it look horrific. And the data itself tells us a completely different story. And this is how they abuse the data. That's just a glaring example. One of the other climate apocalypse events we hear about are forest fires. A lot of people think that the forest fires today, we've never seen anything like it. Is that the case? This last national climate assessment featured forest fires. That was the apocalypse du jour for this climate assessment. In that, they showed this chart of acres burned in the United States, and you can see, my God, it's escalating, and it's scary just looking at that chart. But they didn't list a source, and I dug into it, and I finally found where they got it. It was a chart that I had included in my book. Here it is. Here's the full chart. They cherry picked the data from the mid 80s until now. Yes, there's been a slight increase in area burned. Yes, there has. But looking at the data in the full data set back to 1928, we see that the number of fires today are less than 20% of what they were 80, 90 years ago. In this case, the acreage burned now is at a fraction of what it was earlier in the 20th century. again, they're manipulating the data, and this was the U.S. Climate Assessment Report, and it angers me when I find this out, and it's time after time after time we see things like this occur, just abusing the statistics. And again, this is the same chart showing acreage burn with CO2. This study was one of the largest studies of its kind, looking at acreage burned across globally. Again, we see steady decline of areas burned. And again, they concluded our results suggest a notable declining rate of burned area globally. And this is real. This is from the Canadian Forest Service, that they also looked at Northern Hemisphere forests and fires. And I wanted to say that they concluded, we believe that global warming since the mid-19th century may have triggered decreases in fire frequency and may lead to further decreases. They concluded that global warming is leading to fewer fires. Again, completely opposite of what we're being told. And the reason for that, we'll get to that, the reason for that in a little bit, but it's probably an increase in soil moisture content. Warming temperatures mean there's a slight increase in precipitation, and increasing CO2 means that trees and plants need less water to survive. And again, I love CO2 and plants love CO2 for good reason. I was just looking at some of your Colorado members might know about they're now pumping CO2 directly from breweries into the marijuana greenhouses right next door. And you can see here this is Dr. Craig Inso, one of the CO2 coalition members, and his what an increase in CO2 will do to this particular type of pine tree. We just referenced the increasing soil moisture worldwide. So rising temperatures lead to more water vapor, which leads to more moisture, which leads to more precipitation. CO2 fertilization lowers plants' water needs. Again, and if you think about it, with CO2 fertilization, the plants don't go through transpiration. They don't transpire as much. In other words, breathing in and out. And it's that expiration where the water vapor is expelled from the plants. So with lower CO2, they need much more water because they're losing it quicker. And that's part of the greening of the earth that we're going to look at. This is what I call the greatest untold story of the late 20th and early 21st century. It's this greening of the earth. It's a fantastic story. This is according to NASA. And if you don't believe me, you go, oh, that Wrightstone, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Well, just Google 2 words, NASA and greening, and you'll see what NASA has to say. They say that up to 50% of the earth has increasing vegetation, or it's greening. Less than 4% of the earth is what they call browning, or loss of vegetation. That's a pretty good trade-off. I'd take that any day of the week. And the interesting thing too is that we're seeing this, it's really accentuated in the polar regions and also in formerly arid areas of Australia, China, India, and Africa. Probably the greatest example is the Sahel, the Southern Sahara in Africa. The desert has shrunk by 700,000 square kilometers over the last several decades. People are moving in. It's turning into a lush grassland. Animals are even moving into this area, gazelles and even amphibians. It's a huge, huge story that should be celebrated. It should be front page of the New York Times, but it'll never be. Again, this is from Dr. Craig Idso that we saw with the pine tree earlier. He did laboratory studies showing what a 300 part per million increase would do to crop growth. And he looked at crops that provide 90% of food, of our plant food for the earth. He found that there would be an average 46% increase in crop growth. That's a great story. That's a really, really not a good story. It's a great story. We'll be able to feed a growing population because of increasing CO2. And it's also turbocharged then by temperature. Again, we look here at grains. We see that's temperature increase leads to more harvest, higher harvest, because we have longer growing seasons. Killing frosts stop earlier in the spring and arrive later in the fall. So we have longer growing seasons and more plantings. And then it's turbocharged by this increase in CO2 that's fueling plant growth and crop growth. And here's a great one that I just put together yesterday, looking at recent data from the US corn, the grain yield bushels per acre in the United States. Look at the strong correlation between corn production in bushels per acre and CO2. Just as we started ramping up CO2, we had explosive growth in the yield by bushels per acre. What a great chart. Really good correlation. And this is causation along with correlation. We're also told that droughts are increasing. They are not. I could have thrown up 4 more charts showing this, but this was a huge study on global droughts. And we see that global droughts of all types are in decline. Completely opposite, here I go again, completely opposite of what you're being told. And we're often told, aren't we, that global warming is going to kill people, that we're all going to suffer, people will die. This is the study by Antonio Gasparini. He looked at, and a team of doctors from around the world, they looked at 74 million temperature-related deaths in 13 countries. The blue charts are cold-related deaths. The orange and red are heat-related deaths. According to them, 20 times as many people die due to cold as due to heat. And from this, we can conclude that global warming saves lives. And then we're also told about extreme weather, that it's increasing. It is not. Here are a number of extreme weather related deaths in the United States since 1920. We can see here that the number of people that die due to extreme weather deaths have declined 98% since 1920. Completely opposite of what we're being told. And again, we hear about hurricanes. You'll probably hear it again this summer because my friend Joe Bastardi at Weather Bell just came out this week, and it was actually CFACT Craig Rucker posted Joe Bastardi's forecast of a strong hurricane season. Those happen from time to time, but you have to put don't look at 1 year, but look at multiple years in the long-term context. And in this case, we have landfalling hurricanes into the United States by decade, and we've actually seen a decline in those hurricanes. I'm gonna close it up because I want to take on some questions here. But we have policies that slow CO2 emissions are based on these flawed climate models that exaggerate warming greatly. And we believe that overall CO2 is an overall benefit. We can look at the modest warming combined with increasing CO2 is having nothing but a positive impact on the Earth's ecosystems and on humanity, and we should celebrate that. So I love CO2, and look at the devastation of the foliage behind me there. So I love CO2, and you should too. So thank you, and with that, I'm going to stop and take some questions. I'm going to stop and take some questions.
All right, so we do have one question from Tom. He would like to know why we haven't seen a reduction in the rise of total atmospheric CO2 being measured by monitoring stations that would represent the decrease in fossil fuel usage due to the COVID-19 lockdowns.
Great question. I have that same question myself. We have not seen, just really great question. I've looked at that. I've been monitoring this. I maybe every 3 months I'm looking at it. Man, it hasn't budged. We continue to increase at almost exactly the same rate. We just went through this tremendous lockdown due to COVID and hasn't done anything to it. What does that tell you? Well, we're going to have stronger lockdowns, right? If we're going to stop CO2 emissions, you're going to have to pay the price. Sorry, suck it up, everybody. No, And what we've seen here too, just yesterday, John Kerry did us a great, I don't agree with John Kerry about much of anything, but I agreed with him yesterday and today. Yesterday on CNN, he said that if China and the United States reduced 100% of its CO2 emissions, it would have no effect on global climate change or temperature. And today he doubled down. He said if the entire world went to zero emissions of CO2, he said the same thing. It's not going to have any impact. Well, why are we spending $2.5 trillion? You know how much we should spend? Zero, not one penny. And the Republicans need, they anger me. They're saying, oh, well, we don't want to spend 2.3. Let's just spend 1 trillion. No, not one penny. So sorry, I get we got to fight this.
I completely agree. So we have another question from David. He asks, why the climate distortion? What's the motivation?
I get asked that a lot. I had 6 interviews today, and I was asked it. 5 of the interviewers asked me that question. Basically, you're asking, why are they lying to us, right? Isn't that the question? And I always turn it around to the people that ask me that and tell them, I can't see inside men's or women's souls for their motivation. I can give you the science that says, yes, they're lying to you. They're telling you this, and the science says this. But Julia, you are just as qualified as I am to tell me why they're doing it. I mean, is it control, taxes? There's so many things we could point at why they might be doing it. But again, you're just as qualified, Julia, as I am to tell us why they're doing it. I'll provide you with the science that says yes, they are. But I think there are a lot of different reasons for different people. Funding, I don't know.
Yeah, anything would make sense at this point. It seems Nancy has a question or comment. She asks, they have been saying that as methane increases, that is the dangerous gas, not CO2. Please comment.
Yeah, methane, we've got a paper at the CO2 Coalition dealing with that. Yeah, methane's a much more potent greenhouse gas than CO2, but there's a much lower quantity of that. And they're blaming it on oil and gas facilities, but there's very little methane that escapes from that. It is, after all, the product that they sell. If you were a cattle rancher and you were allowing 2 or 3% of your cattle to just run off periodically, you wouldn't do that. And it's the same thing with natural gas producers. They have a product to sell, and any bit of that escapes is product they can't sell. And we just know that there are a lot of natural methane sources for that. But it's again, if you go to the co2coalition.org, one of our papers we just published last year dealt specifically with methane.
All right. We have a question from Edward. He asks, is the decrease in true critical thinking in education contributing to our inability to look logically at what's happening?
Oh my, yes. Oh, yeah, there's, in fact, we just edited a paper by one of our senior fellow, Patrick Michaels. If you don't have his book, Lukewarming, you might want to look at it, but he's got a paper we'll be publishing here coming up shortly about critical thinking and how academia has been silenced. He was silenced. He was in academia. Yeah, critical thinking is, we're looking at that right now at the CO2 Coalition and having a lot of discussions about that in the college setting.
Sounds very interesting. I'll definitely have to look into that. Mike asks, or he says, the corn correlation chart may be the result of improved farming practices, including more prolific seeds.
There is an impact, yes. And when in my book, I go into that. I didn't mention it tonight, but yeah, when we look at crop growth, part of it's mechanization, part of it's GMO. But if you look at the experts, they're pointing as rising temperatures and increasing CO2 is one of the great contributors to increased crop growth. But it's not I might have overstated that, but but yeah, there are other things that go into it rather than just temperature and CO2. But there's certainly, we're being told, aren't we, that crops and famine will occur because of that. And we see nothing but positive benefits.
Okay. Also, Marilyn asks, is it true that Manning cannot provide the underlying data that supports his hockey stick chart?
Oh, I devote quite a bit of time debunking Michael Mann in my next book, and he's refused to do that. He abused the data. He manipulated the data. He cherry picked the data. He absolutely fabricated some data. He took charts and cut off that went back to the medieval warm period and lopped that part off so it wouldn't impact. He used the book, his so-called hockey stick of 900 years of steady cooling, and then all of a sudden in the 20th century, skyrocketing temperatures. And what he did, most of that was based on one kind of tree ring data, bristlecone pine tree ring data in the Southwest United States. And it's interesting. You heard me mention Craig Idso. He and another fellow actually did the study that Michael Mann used. And in that study, they warned not to use this data for temperature reconstruction. They said, don't do it. It's related to CO2 fertilization. Michael Mann used it anyhow. And that's really the basis of his part of the other mistakes he made. That's the basis for his hockey stick, and that's the basis for a lot of what we're doing right now. Trillions of dollars spent on nothing, chasing unicorns.
Yeah, I wonder, that's very interesting to me. I wonder how more people haven't caught on to that, you know?
Well, they hide a lot of this. And if you look at some of his apostles that worship at the feet of Michael Mann, they've come out with additional things. It's called Pages 2K. They're just riddled with data. Some of this, we caught them with data inverted from what it should have been. They used just completely bad data, and they all also used the bristlecone pine data included in these studies, because that gives them a hockey stick.
Yeah. Don has a question. If they were serious about concern for CO2 rise, why not advocate less expensive nuclear energy rather than wind and solar, which have had huge environmental impact to create, maintain, and dispose of after a relatively short life?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's interesting. There are a couple people out there right now with books, Michael Schellenberger and Bjorn Lomborg. They're both were big environmentalists, radical environmentalists that saw the light. Now they're saying, no, this is stupid. I don't agree with a lot of Schellenberger and Bjorn Lomborg, because they assume that, yes, there's a crisis, or yes, things are going to get really bad. And no, they're not. We don't see any evidence of that right now. Nuclear is a good option. It's expensive, but the problem with, I just don't see any new nuclear being built in the United States anytime soon. France adopted a pro-nuclear agenda 40 some years ago, and they've really embraced it. 80% of their electricity in France is nuclear. Germany went just the opposite way, and we're decommissioning both their nuclear and coal plants. Today in Germany, their electricity generation is twice the cost of France, and they just nearly did a Texas-style grid lockdown back in February, very similar at the same time that Texas went through that. They're being plagued by the same problems of unreliable energy. And the one thing when we talk about electricity, I use 3 descriptors: reliable, abundant, and affordable. Those are the things we should, that's only fossil fuels.
I completely agree. So David had a comment. He says there is an enormous amount of carbon buried in the earth that was formerly in the air. It didn't kill the planet then, so it should not kill us now.
Well, that's true. We saw that. If we look back through, if you remember that chart I had of 600 million years, we had there were two big sequestration. That's when the CO2 is taken out of the atmosphere. It's incorporated in rocks, either through muds that sink or coal swamps that capture it. Most of it is taken, a lot of it's taken by deposition and creation of limestones and dolomites, because limestone is CaCO3. And so a large amount of that, we saw the one big event when the rise of the woody plants occurred. We saw that really, and along with the coal swamps, that really sucked huge amounts of CO2 out of the atmosphere. And also at that same time, some of these great shale reservoirs were also sucking. They were creating. They were black organic rich muds that went to the bottom and accumulated years and years and years on top of each other. And now we're liberating that. And but he was right. Life for both plants and animals prospered during those very high CO2 times, and they will again.
Definitely. Something that I've definitely learned is that over the course of like working for CFACT is that carbon dioxide is definitely good for the environment, and it's not as bad as it's made out to be. So we have a question from Douglas, and he says, do you think that human CO2 emissions will be able to offset the sustained decay of 150 million years?
Good question. I'm not sure. I hope so. I hope it continues. We're doing some really stupid things right now. The Biden administration, these people are saying we need, what they're proposing is a solution to the climate crisis. Well, I call it a solution in search of a problem. Everything we see is the CO2 has been increasing and beneficial. And I mean, if you look on the back of my SUV, you saw my mask here, I heart CO2. I've got I love CO2 bumper sticker on my truck. I haven't been keyed yet, but we'll see. I'm in Arlington now. That might happen at any day. Yeah. But it's a great conversation starter. And again, just about everywhere I go, I just bought a new Android here a couple of weeks ago. And I went in, there were three guys that I talked, that were there. They got a man bun, they're all tatted up. And I started talking to them. Their eyes are like wide open. And they were just really, really, and I pulled out my smartphone because the smartphone app is, every single person on this call should get Inconvenient Facts smartphone app. You can have this information, some of what you saw tonight, you can have that in the palm of your hand. Just go down, it's free. And it's a useful tool. And I pulled it out and showed it, and they were like, wow. And I went out to my truck and I got them each a book. And I see that it played out time and time again. People are thirsty for this information.
I definitely agree. I've brought it up like in the classroom before, and it's just something that people don't know because it's taught the one way to everyone. So Brian asks, do you have an input as to what causes glacial melting?
Warming temperatures. Period.
Yep.
No, it is. We can see that through each of the previous warm periods, glaciers melted. Or a good example is the Mendenhall Glacier in Juneau. If you've ever been to Alaska, I was there. I took a tour up. They fly in a helicopter. It's pretty cool. And you land on top of the glacier. But you know what's happening at the base of that glacier? Yes, it's retreating. And it's retreating because it's getting warmer. And that's what happens during warm periods. You know what they found at the bottom of that glacier, what they have right now? There is a mature forest that was from the medieval warm period that's being exposed under that glacier. Well, what does that tell us? Think about that. During that time, there was no glacier, and a matured forest grew. I mean, these are a number of feet across that grew during that medieval warm period. And so it had to have been a lot warmer back then. So periodically, during warm periods, glaciers retreat. And what that does is raise the sea level. And for example, in the Roman warm period, you could look along the Mediterranean. The Romans built forts that that they built that are now, they were seaside forts that are now kilometers inland. And that's because the sea was much higher at that time. And then it got cold, more ice got locked up into the glaciers, and the sea level fell. So we're just recovering from the sea level fall during the Little Ice Age.
That makes sense. So we have a question from, oh, I just lost it. John, he asks, has anyone modeled the relation between water vapor and temperature?
It has,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm not going to touch that because I don't have all the facts. I'm smart enough to know when I shouldn't be addressing topics that I don't know enough about. I do know, though, that all the data tell us that a rise in temperature means that the atmosphere can hold more water vapor, which could then lead to more precipitation. But again, I'm no expert on this. I'll repeat what the experts tell me.
That makes sense. So there is an anonymous question. It says, how much does decrease in deaths due to extreme weather events result from better forecasting and warning systems?
Oh, it does. That's the primary. My point with that was, that's not what we're being told, is it? We're being told that extreme weather deaths are increasing, and they'll continue to increase when they continue to decrease. So yeah, a lot of this is due to better reporting. For example, tornadoes. I didn't include the tornado data, and tornadoes are in decline, by the way, for sure. But again, we have much better reporting. We can tell when hurricanes are coming. So yeah, that's a big part of it. But that also, we can also look at extreme weather events themselves. In theory, they should decline with warming temperatures, because warming temperatures by themselves do not cause extreme weather. What extreme weather is caused from is differential temperatures. In other words, a difference between cold and heat. When those two meet up, that's when you get extreme weather. So the rising temperature kind of equals that out a little bit more, and might be a reason why we're seeing fewer extreme weather events.
Definitely. I would definitely say that that's true. Pete would like to know, how do we determine temperatures millions of years ago, and how accurate are the proxies?
Yeah, they look at oxygen isotopes. I'm not an expert. It's pretty complicated. There's pretty good acceptance that they're not perfect, but we can get somewhat of a relative indication of warmth versus temperature. The long-term data from tree rings, you have to be, again, Michael Mann abused that. But if you select the right tree ring from the right area, you can use that. Again, think about it. If it's a high altitude tree near the tree line, or a high latitude in Canada near the tree line, well, then if it's warmer, it'll probably grow faster. But that's not true in Georgia, because it's warm there all the time. That's more probably a relation. The tree ring thickness is probably due to precipitation and not temperature.
Mm-hmm.
So all of these we have to take care. They use ocean sediments, cave stalagmites and stalactites that accumulate over time. There's different isotope variations there.
Okay. So Edward would like to know, do you take the same presentation to members of Congress? And if so, what is the reception or feedback?
Not yet. We're working on that. I'm meeting with a high staff member on Monday at my office. And yeah, we want to be more effective. We have the science, some of the top scientists in the world. We've got people like Dr. Richard Linz and Dr. from MIT, Dr. Will Happer, that I work with on a daily basis. Patrick Moore. These are legends. Pat Michaels. It was Patrick Moore's got a new book out. So we can tap a lot of people to get this information out there. And And I'm proud to work with the CO2 Coalition. We deal with the science, try and stay away from the politics, and we do want to have an input on Capitol Hill. We're just starting with COVID now being nearly over. Hopefully, we'll be able to do that. And again, I'm meeting Monday morning with a representative, high staff member that's on the Energy Committee. Just asked today to testify in Harrisburg to the Energy Resource Committee about some things that the governor of Pennsylvania wants to do that's harmful. So I'll be going up there to do that. So yes, we do that. We provide, and that's the value of having great scientists like this.
Yeah, I would definitely be interested to see that, because it seems to me that a lot of members of Congress have opinions on it, but it's opinions and not facts. So they could definitely be educated.
And I wish I had come on here before, because we're going to be having, we're in the final stages of hiring an intern here. So you're a little bit late. We'll be having more interns next year.
Awesome. I'm sad that I missed it, but that's all right. So David says, I understand that water vapor, due to high concentration and IR absorptivity, is about 10 times stronger than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. Is this ever discussed?
Rarely. And again, they need to hide this. There's no discussion at all about the effects of water vapor, or if it is, it's well hidden. And it's just, again, they need to silence anything that doesn't agree with the notion of catastrophic man-made warming. And we see the funding being driven by that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, throughout this whole Zoom call, it's just been more apparent to me that there's a lot of hiding of information.
And manipulation of data. You saw that
yeah.
the extinction report. When I dug into that, my data there that you saw was used in congressional testimony. Dr. Patrick Moore of the CO2 Coalition, Mark Morano he testified there too. He used, and you're all familiar with Mark, but he testified there as well using my data, just showing how blatantly they had abused the scientific process. They tortured the data.
Yep. It seems to be like a common occurrence among science and climate science specifically now. So I have another question from James, and it is, if carbon dioxide emissions are responsible for climate change, why is the UN not insisting urgent action from China, which uses 49% of all global coal production?
Yeah, that's the elephant in the room, the gorilla in the room. Yeah. And again, yeah, and it was funny when Joe Biden and Kerry were senators back in 1997. They signed on to a bill that was voted 99-0 in the Senate, that the United States would not reduce any emissions until China did. Well, what's changed? What's changed since then? The politics have changed. China gets a pass. They said, well, we're not going to do anything about our emissions until 2030. And they keep building power plant after power plant fueled with coal. And that's because President Xi knows they need to have an economy like this. They need reliable, abundant, affordable energy. Prime Minister Modi in India knows the same thing. That again, I think Prime Minister Modi is a good man, and he wants to lift his entire country up out of generational poverty and provide electricity to it.
Okay. Yeah, it's definitely been interesting to see the harshness on the US when there are other countries that could definitely reduce their emissions.
Well, yeah, you have to know, President Xi of China right now, he's rubbing his hands together in glee. He wants to destroy our economy, I think, doesn't he? Or at least he wants to build his up compared to us. He doesn't have to do a darn thing now. We're doing it to ourselves. We're committing economic suicide if we go through with what's being proposed right now. He's got to be just, well, he wouldn't be dancing a jig because he's Chinese, but he's going to be, he'll have, he's got to be going like this right now, ha ha ha, because he's getting what he wants and doesn't have to do anything. because we're doing it to ourselves.
Definitely. Do you have time for one last question?
Yes.
Okay. So Don asks, over the last 40 years, there have been numerous predictions of disasters which they said would have happened by now. Is there a good list of these failed predictions somewhere that you can point us to?
Yeah. Steve Malloy at junkscience.com has a good compilation. You could probably find it pretty easily there. I think his is the best. There are a number of these out there, but I go to junkscience.com and look there. Yeah, there's the crazy predictions about this. Everything from the toenail fungus was one that was going to increase. And I was going to say poison ivy, but actually poison ivy probably will increase because all the plants benefit from increased CO2.
Right. So it looks like we're about out of time. Thank you so much for presenting your presentation, and it's been a pleasure having you on here. And thank you for everyone joining tonight.
Yeah, get the Inconvenient Facts smartphone app. You will love it.